Hey everybody, welcome back. Alright, so we're going to get onto the lead melody and how that was made in the next lesson, but in this lesson I want to get the bass line made. So the most important thing to consider when making the bass line is how much of a main element it's going to be in your track. So as you might notice, I've got an extra track in here which wasn't in the last lesson. So this is like the sort of reasonably rough edit that I did before the tutorial when I first created the song. So I'm just going to play you the chorus part of the track. So we can hear there that we've got quite a lot going on. We've got guitars, we've got leads, we've got all the drums and everything like that. So when we're picking the elements for our track, we do have to consider all of the other elements. In this case, the bass line really wants to be something that kind of just sits in the background, just helping the song chug along, rather than having the bass line, say, like a main element. So just to expand on this a bit, in some like EDM tracks, the bass line is one of the main elements, and in other tracks, the bass line is sort of hardly noticeable. Obviously, you'd notice if it wasn't there because you'd lack all that nice sub bass, but it's not really sort of like a very prominent feature in the track. For example, in Avicii's track Wake Me Up, which this song is kind of loosely modelled on, you almost don't notice that it has a bass line as it's more of a background element. It just sort of chugs away and provides that nice warm subbiness. But it doesn't take anything away from the rest of the track, which is the guitars and the leads and the vocal. Now, I mention this because obviously it depends on the type of EDM track you're going for, how you're going to make your bass line. So if you're making more of a club sort of EDM track, then the bass line is going to be one of the defining elements of your track. Then you're going to be working on that like pretty much straight away and getting it nice and fat, and then building the rest of the track around that. Now, in this case, this is much more of a sort of pop EDM track rather than a club EDM track. We have the vocal, we've got guitar, we've got lead, so the bass line just needs to play more of a supporting role. And if we also try to make the bass line like one of the main elements to make it really fat as well as everything else, then it's gonna start sounding like a bit of a mess. And all we would do by doing that is actually make all of the other elements sound smaller. So one of the keys to getting a nice big sound in your mix is picking the right elements, or picking the elements that you want to be the big elements, and then letting those elements be big and have their own space rather than have other elements try and sort of crowd the space. Now, we're going to be getting into mixing a lot more in the tutorial later on, but it's important even at this early stage to start considering the type of track you're creating, and so you can start picking the right elements and how they fit into your track. All right, so let's just load up another Vital instrument. And before I get into the sound design part, let's just make the bassline note. So all I'm going to do is copy it down the Vital Pad MIDI, and let's just quickly rename this as well. Bassline, and let's just go into this. So very easy to make a bassline when you already have the notes. So the most common way of creating the bassline or getting the notes for the bassline is just to use the root notes of your chord progression. Now, sometimes if there is like a really big variation between the notes, like there isn't in this one, it's absolutely fine. We've got 1, 2, 3 semitones, 1, 2, 3 semitones, and then 5 semitones, which is absolutely fine. But sometimes in your bass line, you might find that the root notes have sort of too much of a gap between them, like there's too many semitones from the root note or from the tonic of the scale, in which case you can, if you want to, use a different note in the chord. So for example, on this last note here, you could choose to use the A or the F instead. Just putting that out there because sometimes the bass line, if you have a really big sort of gap in the semitones, it's going to sound a bit weird and you'll lose sort of some bass on some of the notes and then have too much bass on other notes. It's just one of those balancing acts. But in this one, it's fine. So let's just use these. Now I'm going to just delete all the other notes from that, and we're just going to select these, shorten them till they're 1/8 of a bar long, and then I'm just going to copy these over so they're all on the offbeat. Let me just turn that down. Sorry, it's a little bit loud. I'll just play it. So very, very simple. And now let's actually get into making the sound itself. I'm just going to mute the pad for now, just so that's not sort of conflicting with what we're hearing. If you want to load up the preset, go to the hamburger menu, again, open external preset, navigate to the work files, vital patches, and then we've got bass offbeat 01, so just load that up. So quite a nice sort of EDM sounding bass line. Again, not massively complicated, but it is a step up from what we did with the pad. So we've used some sort of wave shaping or some of the vital wave shaping capabilities. And as per usual, what I'm going to do is reset this and make it from scratch. Obviously, just carry on with the preset if you want to. All right, let's initialize the preset. And the first thing I'm going to do is go and change this to a square wave. Because at the moment, actually, let's just solo this. So it's not really a very nice bass sounding oscillator. You can use a saw wave, but I tend to find a square wave works a bit better, at least as the sort of bass as the sound. So let's go in and go to the factory bank and go basic shapes. And we'll just change this till we get a square. So let's just change that down 1 octave as well. Okay, then we're going to add another oscillator. I'm going to change this up 1 octave though, and we'll leave it on the initialized preset, which is just a saw wave. So one thing you can notice straight away is that it has this kind of movement to it. Each note sounds very slightly different. It's almost like a phasing effect. So the way to get around that is to set the phase of the oscillators to 0%. And then it just sounds the same on every single hit. All right, so that's fine, but let's just add a bit of variation to this. So we're going to go into here and select Formant Scale. And as you can see, it just sort of modifies the waveform a little bit, depending on where you set it. We can play around with this as we go. Let's just get all of the oscillators in though. So let's go and activate oscillator 3. Again, we'll just use the normal saw wave and let's change this to harmonic stretch. So these are all just various different ways of changing or morphing the wave shape. Again, we want to set this to 0 randomization. So we get a nice consistent solid bass sound. It's no good when it's sort of morphing all over the place. Just have a little balance here with the volumes. And let's just change this as well, so it's up 2 octaves. Now what we're doing here is just getting the texture sort of roughly where we want it, and then of course we've got to shape the sound. So let's activate filter 1. I'm going to turn down the resonance almost all the way. And also we need to make sure that these are all going through filter 1, so we can do that here just by selecting on the filter itself. Okay, so let's start with that. And now I just want to shape it a bit just to give it a little bit more punch than what it's got at the moment. So let's turn the attack right down. And then we're just going to bring the sustain down a bit. Make this a little bit more snappy. You can zoom in using a mouse wheel as well if you want. So something like that is absolutely fine. Just gives it just a slight bit more punch, that's all. And that is the sort of main part of the sound sorted. Now we just got to tweak it a bit with some effects. So let's go to the effects page. Let's add a multi-band compressor. This is a lovely compressor. And to be fair, I just like the initialized sort of preset that comes with the multi-band compressor. It sounds nice. It just sort of brightens it up. So we're going to leave that how it is, but I do want to add a bit of distortion as well. Let's have it on linear fold. Lovely. Let's just back off the mix a bit. Giving it a bit sort of digital growl. Very nice. Now let's just tweak the EQ. So we'll add an EQ plugin. Just want to tame that sort of growl a little bit, not too much though. Remember, when we've got our track, there's going to be guitars and leads all over the top, providing the sort of high frequencies and mid-range of the track, so we don't really want too much from the bass line. Again, it's all about getting your elements to not conflict with each other. So let's go with something like that, and then a bit of reverb. So bass sounds, generally speaking, you want to remove some of the low end. If you have too much reverberation on the low end, it's going to mean that the low end of your track gets very messy. So we're just going to carve out a bit of the low frequencies from the reverb. And we don't want much. I mean, we can balance this later on, but I'm just going to add a very small amount to the bass line. And it's sounding pretty good so far. So, happy days. I think we're pretty much there with that. Let's just play it with the rest of the track. Just turning it up a little bit. Okay, so there we go. Another layer. And a slightly more advanced sound to make is that bass line, but in the next few lessons we're going to get into some even more advanced sound design with the layered leads. So that's it for the free lessons of this course. I hope you've enjoyed it so far. If you want to carry on making this track and learn all about music production techniques, then definitely follow the link in the description and go check out the rest of the course. It really does help us out, and it means that we can keep making these really in-depth, very detailed tutorials. They take a long time to make, so your support is absolutely vital. And it's just the best way to learn about music production. So thank you very much for watching, guys and girls. Hope to see you in the next one.